Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Simulation Cinema podcast. My name is Arbel Chappelle. I am your host, and today we're going to talk about story structure. Going all the way back, Aristotle was the first person to talk about story structure in his seminal publishing called The Poetics. If we look at story structure, particularly in Western culture, we can map the history all the way back to Aristotle. Now, the historians today believe that he didn't actually develop it. He just wrote it down as a scientist observes. So he looked at, well, what are the stories people like? And the ones that are popular all have these three elements. They have a beginning, middle, and end. And then a whole slew of playwrights after that developed the next parts of story structure: rising tension, inciting incidents, point of attack. So in this podcast, I'm going to take you through what those things are for current day Western protagonist-based story structure. I'm not going to get into the history so much. I'll say that for another podcast. Also, there are other story structures that I won't get into on this podcast either. I'll say that for another podcast. But today we're going to talk about Western story structure. I made this chart about 10 years ago to help me keep track of all the different publications on story structure there are out there, and there are many. So I put the ones that I like the most onto this chart. The ones that I like the most came from my education from USC Film School. So I used the 8-sequence structure. I also used Save the Cat, and those were like the two popular ones I put on this chart. In Act 1, you establish the status quo. In Act 2, the character wants something very badly and is having trouble to get it. This is where you start to show all those difficulties. In Act 3, you have the resolution of the story, and then you figure out if the character really gets what they want and how does their life get better or worse as a result. Those are the three elements of the story: Act 1 beginning, Act 2 middle, Act 3 end. Digging deeper, at USC, they taught 8-sequence structure. Act 1, sequences 1 and 2. Act 2, sequence 3, 4, 5, and 6. Act 3, sequences 7 and 8. Well, where the hell did these sequences come from? There's a gentleman, professor at SC called David Howard, who wrote a book about story structure, and his premise was these sequences existed because of the technology limitations of the time when cinema started. When cinema started, you had a reel of film that only lasted about 10 minutes long. And because you had to actually physically change the reel while the show was going on, you had these story segments that were built because of the limitation of the technology of the time. This is where the sequence comes from. 8 sequences in the movie, 2 in Act 1, 4 in Act 2, 2 in Act 3. Within these sequences, you have various story elements. Story elements like Save the Cat, which comes from Siegfried's methodology. So where does all this come from? Well, it comes from the 2,000 plus history of narrative development. And smart people across this time have been like experimenting with story, and then people start to write down, well, what worked, what didn't work? Well, this seemed to work and this seemed not to work. And the things that tended to work in terms of popularity of the stories of the time is what went into narrative theory currently. And this chart goes through some of the people who have contributed to that. I'm not going to go through it, but I'll leave it up to you to go Google some of these people. Aristotle was the first, but there have been many, many others. So thank you for watching the story structure version of the Simulation Cinema podcast. I will be going through how this applies to simulation content in the future. So stay tuned to the podcast. Check out the website where there's a lot more information that goes a lot more in depth. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.